Ladies and gentlemen, let's Game into the video. We're going to be talking about the RX 480 versus the GTX 1060. Quite a few people have been messaging me over the past 24 to 48 hours asking which card should they buy, and we will be doing a full review of the GTX 1060. In fact, it's one of the reasons we've been actually holding back the RX 480 review, simply because the timings are so damn close to one another. It just makes more sense to amalgamate them into a almost like comparison type of scenario. So in the meanwhile, we've been really busy with the GTX 1070. But I did decide to put this video out having a look at some benches myself to give you some ideas of what I think is best if you are trying to make the decision right now and buy a graphics card. I'm going to assume for the most part you're fairly familiar with the specifications of the GPU. You know, it's got 1280 CUDA cores. It has a maximum overclock of around 2 GHz, although that does of course depend a lot on Silicon Lottery and the model of the card you're going for. And of course, the big deal is it does not feature SLI support, which we'll go more into in just a moment. This is all wrapped up with 6 GB of memory. But let's face it, the specifications have been talked about ad nauseum over the past couple of weeks, and so performance, that's what really counts. So we're going to talk about some of the benchmarks which have emerged. We're going to talk, of course, about DirectX 12, some Vulkan stuff, and also the more traditional renderer, DirectX 11. Doom has a slight advantage with OpenGL on the GTX 1060, but if we move over to Vulkan, we can see this very quickly changes, and the RX 480 has quite a large advantage with Vulkan enabled. Now, one can argue, in my personal opinion, that you're not really going to use OpenGL, generally speaking, because it just doesn't make sense to. This doesn't actually favour the RX 480 in that, well, Vulkan still is a slight improvement on the GTX 1060 anyway, but utilising it with the 480 gives you a massive improvement in frame rate, 143 versus 121 of the GTX 1060. Now, the story is very similar with a lot of titles on DirectX 12, but your mileage may vary. 88 frames a second with Tomb Raider compared to 74 with DirectX 12, and if you push up the resolution, the GTX 1060 is just shy of holding on to 60 FPS compared to 49 of the RX 480. So it's very close, but doesn't quite manage to be even. And same thing for 1080p. If you max out Rise of the Tomb Raider, the GTX 1060 hits around 62 frames a second, whereas you get 52 with the RX 480. Metro Last Light, the GTX 1060 on average gets around 94 frames a second, and with the RX 480 you're hitting 81 frames a second at 1080p, which once again is fairly close, whereas Far Cry Primal at 1440p, 44 frames a second compared to 48 frames a second. Now, we could continue to go through a whole bunch of benchmarks, but suffice to say that the GTX 1060 is on average around 10% faster, depending on the benchmark. So for example, in DirectX 12 or Vulkan, the 1060 loses a lot of its advantage, whereas with OpenGL or DirectX 12, DirectX 11, then the 1060 manages to start strutting its legs a little more, although it does also depend a lot upon the game engine as well, as you can imagine. This leads to my thoughts on the two cards. The performance difference between them is fairly tight. The GTX 1060 is currently available in the UK at around the 240 mark. That's the base level, that's the cheapest cards. I'm looking at Overclockers UK. Currently Amazon does not have them, at least when I looked a while back. I'm not endorsing overclockers.co.uk, by the way. That's not a sponsorship or any other thing. They're just one e-tailer that I've happened to use. You can by all means use any one you want. But in the US, you're looking at around 250 for the base model. This is, once again, a little more expensive than the RX 480s are. So my advice to you is the following. you've got a couple of options. The first is you wait until we've got more data on the custom cooler variants of the RX 480s to see how they clock. Also to see if prices settle for the cards, especially on the RX 480. AMD may decide to cut a little more money off of them. And you could also, with that same logic, potentially see if there's a trend regarding the RX 480 4GB models. If you're confident enough, then you could decide to go for one of those and perhaps BIOS mod it to unlock the rest of the memory, the 8GB, which most cards, as far as I've been reading, do have enabled. I say most because I don't want to give you hopes and expectations. So that would potentially mean you had an 8GB RX 480 for only around the 200 mark, actually slightly cheaper than that if you really look around, or you've got discount or coupons or what have you. If you do not ever feel that you're in the next 6 to 12 months going to be upgrading to a larger display, then the GTX 1060 is probably the better option, especially if you're feeling like you're going to overclock or power draw is a really big deal. If you feel that that's the reverse and you may potentially go the 4K route, then the RX 480 may be the better option because you've got crossfire. Nvidia removed SLI support for the GTX 1060, citing the fact that for whatever reason they say that they don't feel it's large enough demand. So basically, if in 6 months time you do once again decide to go for a larger screen resolution, or conversely the advent of the Scorpio, the Neo and all of these other consoles coming out means that we're going to see better quality games, higher quality graphics, larger textures and all of that stuff, and the GTX 1060 can no longer cut the mustard at the resolution or settings you want, you're screwed. You're going to have to do a total upgrade, where at least with the RX 480 you could probably by that point get a fairly cheap second card from eBay and maybe do a pretty nice upgrade and get around the same performance of the GTX 1080. I'm not, however, advocating buy two cards right now. If you've only got the money for a single card solution, then maybe the GTX 1070, if you've got that level of cash, is probably better because you know that it's going to run cooler and you know that it's going to run across a myriad of different games with no issues at all. You don't have to worry about patching, but that's a decision that you're going to have to make. Ultimately, this comes down to a few things. Do you care about DirectX 12, asynchronous compute, and the possibilities of Vulkan in the future? If so, the RX 480 with the additional memory may be the better purchase. If you're buying a card for the here and now, DirectX 11 primarily, then maybe Nvidia is the better option, especially if doing a lot of overclocking. If you're looking from a previous generation point of view, if you're overclocking the RX 480, it can reach almost the Fury levels, but we'll have to wait for more custom card results, unfortunately. With the MSI variants of the gaming ones and a couple of other cards that we've seen from Asus and those reviews, looking at around the 2 to 2.1 GHz, it looks like it's topping out at the GTX 1060, which means it's around the 980 to 980 Ti level of the performance, depending on the game itself. Essentially, what that means to you and I is that the card at the GTX 1060 doesn't quite live up to the performance expectations that Nvidia had set, with it beating the 980, but with some mild overclocking, it certainly does do that. So honestly, this is one of those cards where there's, scenarios where there is no best option. If you're really strapped for cash, then I would suggest the RX 470, which should still be capable of playing 1080p games, although it's only got 4GB of memory, but that should be ample. Or potentially scouring eBay, maybe stalking your friends if they're upgrading to a new generation card, and perhaps going that route, because you can get some really good deals on the 290Xs, the 390s, if you do have a really old card. For folks who are just getting into PC gaming right this moment, then you've got some really good options on either the GTX 1060, the RX 480, and in terms of Nvidia versus AMD technology, honestly, I've run both cards. I run them all the time. I've got, at the moment, 2 Nvidia cards in my machine because I'm reviewing an Nvidia card. I'm reviewing the GTX 1070. Before that, I was running the R9 390, and honestly, In terms of drivers and all of that stuff, I've never had any problems recently with AMD cards. The recent Crimson drivers have been absolutely rock solid. I've not had any crashes, and to be totally honest with you, you don't really notice anything. You know, just fire up the games. I wouldn't worry about that. GeForce experience on Nvidia is quite nice, but there are ways around that with AMD as well, because they're coming out with their own stuff. So that type of stuff, it depends on if you're a streamer or really care about that. If you're just regularly gaming, then that probably doesn't make a blind bit of difference. So just go with the card that's the cheapest or best option for you. This is one of those things where I'll wait to see what happens over the next week or two as drivers mature. Perhaps prices will come down a little, especially from AMD. They might decide to officially drop the retail price a little more to try and counter Nvidia. But for now, I think that's just about it. So that's my thoughts and opinions for what it's worth. But take care of yourselves, guys. Bye for now.